The Black Man of the Nile and His Family, Part 8. C.F. Folney, who visited Tamari, Egypt, Kemet, Sais, Pearl of the Nile in 1787 CE, unlike those orthodox and modern liberal Africanists, wrote that the Greek citizens in Ionian birth, Herodotus, the father of European history, solved for him the problem of why the people, Africans, niggers, Negroes of Egypt were so black and woolly-haired, and especially the Greek Sphinx of Giza, the supreme symbol of worship and power, reflecting on how he, on his trip, met the state of Egypt in its reduced image and grandeur. The Count wrote, "To think that a race of black men who are today our slaves and object of our contempt is the same one to whom we owe our arts, sciences, and even the very use of speech. It is needless to underline any part of the above for specific emphasis, but the reader should understand why the works of Count Volney and others like him are suppressed throughout the United States of America. Thus they cannot be taught. Of the indigenous blacks of Akubalan, Africa, Count Volney saw the ruins of the colossal monuments in Upper Egypt, once a part of Lower Ta-Nehisi or Nubia, also called Zeti. He wrote the account of praises to the Africans shown on the first page of this chapter. Two other respected European scholars of Volney's era who saw the Sphinx of Giza, Baron Vivian Denon and Gustave Flaubert, expressed their opinions. In particular, Denon, who made a first-hand sketch of the Sphinx in 1798 CE, as shown on page 111, wrote that the character is African, the lips are thick, art must have been at a high pitch when this monument was executed. From Baron Vivian Denon, Travels in Upper and Lower Egypt, Volume 1, pages 115 through 1910. Gustave Flaubert identified the Sphinx African group in 1849 when he noted that it is certainly Ethiopian, the lips are thick, etc. Flaubert's comment was extracted from his books, Notes de Voyage, page 115. Baron Denon's first-hand sketch of the Sphinx appears on pages and of this volume. It is to be noted that the black and thick lips, also woolly hair and broad nose, ascribed to the early Egyptians, Nubians, Ethiopians, and other North and East Africans, were commonly used by the ancients of Europe and Asia in describing all of the indigenous peoples of North and East Africa, just as they did for others who came from West, South, and Central parts. In the year 1910 CE, a German scholar and explorer named Leo Frobenius furthered Count C. Volney's work as he influenced the recording of Akubalan's history by subsequent European scholars who took a completely new posture because of his own deep researches and writings on and about the African peoples. In his most basic work, Und Afrika Sparch, English translation, The Voice of Africa or Africa Speaks, Leo Frobenius urged his fellow colleagues to let there be light in Africa, in that portion of the globe to which the stalwart Anglo-Saxon Stanley gave them the name Dark and Darkest, light upon the people of that continent whose children are accustomed to regard as types of natural servility with no recorded history. But the spell has been broken. The buried treasures of antiquity again revisit the sun. On Leo Frobenius' comment, this chapter can be brought to its conclusion, even though it has barely touched the surface of the overwhelming amount of data dealing with praises for Akubalan and her sons and daughters. However, the data in the following chapters will more than explain many of the other laudatory comments which cannot be dwelt upon in this volume because of space and time. Of course, there is an equal amount of adverse comments against Akubalan and her indigenous sons and daughters down through the ages. However, the general public has only heard the adverse comments in the past, not knowing that the opposites exist or caring one iota about the cultural genocide that Africans suffered at the hand of Europeans and European Americans over the last 300 to 400 years, from the vicious slave trade, 1503 through 1865, and the wanton partition of the Alkebulan to the Berlin Conference, 1830 through 1884. The great king Monomotapa, very powerful and rich in gold. Several kings are tributary to him. His territory comprises Lower Ethiopia. His empire is very large and has a circuit of 2,400 miles. His court is at Zimbabwe. There are women in this guard. He has a great number of them in his army, which give great help to the men. He also has a great number of elephants. His subjects are black, brave, and swift runners, and he has very fast horses. Idolaters, sorcerers, and thieves are severely punished. Another look at Nubia, Meroe, Egypt, Ethiopia, etc. Nubia, the lands of the south of Egypt, were inhabited by less civilized people who were good soldiers. They were rich in gold, good quality stone, hard wood, and large cattle. They formed the gateway to Central Africa, whence came ivory, strange animals, and pygmies. The above quotation is taken from the Encyclopedia of Egyptian Civilization, page 191, under the heading of Nubia. This racist proclamation is typical of the most academians' work on Egypt. With respect to other areas of Alkebulan, it was rehatched with the general editor, George Poissonnier, professor at the University of France, with the assistance of Serge Soumarin and John Yoyet et al., and published by Tudor Publishing Company, New York. Of course, this encyclopedia displays pictures and inscriptions from the tombs, pyramids, etc. of many pharaohs and viceroys, depicts the Nubians only as tribute bearers and slaves for the Timerians, Egyptians, but never the relationship is shown in the reverse, the Timerians equally being tribute bearers and slaves for the Tahanesians, Nubians. It ignores the later aspect totally and purposely, for while at the same time adding to their further suppression of pertinent evidence showing the commonality between the Nile valleys, blue and white, indigenous people and their high cultures that came about from the creation of Adam and Eve and the Hebrew God Jehovah by Moses and indigenous Africans of Timeri, yet the editors could not avoid showing pictures that depicted the Tahanesians, Nubians, or Zetis being equally dressed as the Timerians, better jeweled, knowledgeable of the wheel and the chariot bounded, and obviously in control of greater material wealth than their northern neighbors and fellow Africans, the Timerians, Egyptians of the same period. To imply that only certain basic natural materials, of course produced by the so-called pygmies, came to Timeri from their southern neighbors is not only prejudicial to the truth, it is a deliberate attempt at injecting and projecting European and European American white Caucasians and Semitism, in other words, racism, under the disguise of academic scholarship into the history of the ancient indigenous people of the continent of Alkebulan, the so-called Negroes, Bantus, Africans, south of the Sahara, black Africans, of which they were totally unaware. In the first place, where along the entire, more than 4,100 miles long Nile River Valley can any one of the European and European American authorities on Africa pinpoint the ancient divided line or boundaries between Timeri and Tahanesi before the 4th dynasty, 2680 through 2565 BCE. Also for Meroe and Ethiopia, meaning Ethiopia, sometimes called Kush. Obviously, such a line, as established in the mind of many hundreds of white liberal and orthodox authorities on Africa and things African, is as numerous in locations as there are values of books and treaties dealing with this subject, and to expect that we would stop establishing new ones because of the protest of this work or other works of this kind would be hopeless wishful thinking to the 8th degree on part of the believer. The present demarcation of the second cataract as a beginning point for the Ta-Nehisi, Nubia, or Zeti is totally ridiculous and without foundation, when in fact the nome of elephants, Aswan, as always mentioned in the ancients of Timeri and other Nile Valley people as being the territory of the Ta-Nehisians, for it was not until very much later in history before it was observed that the first pharaoh of the first dynastic period, Pharaoh Aha or Namr, also called Mena, came from Upper Ta-Nehisi, Nubia, and unified Lower Ta-Nehisi with Upper and Lower Timeri, Egypt, around the Delta region. This historical fact caused the Egyptologists and other so-called white liberal Africanists to impose their first cataract boundary line between Timeri and Ta-Nehisi, south of the first cataract, to justify their own racist hypotheses of an all-Caucasian and Semitic North and East Africa, especially Timeri. But this type of racism is related directly to the type of material one reads in the Encyclopedia of Egyptian Civilization, which was originally published in the French language as the Dictionnaire de la Civilisation of Egypt, Paris, 1959. The European and European American historians and Egyptologists of Caucasian and or Semitic schools have conveniently forgotten that commercial, as well as social and sexual, intercourse among all of the indigenous Nile Valley blue and white Africans were commonplace before the first so-called white Caucasian, Semite, or Hamite, otherwise called Hyksos, or shepherd kings of Bedouina from Asia, arrived in northeast Africa, Akubalan et Timeri, about 1675 BCE, at which time the indigenous Africans, Negroes, Bantus, Pygmies, or whatever else had already developed, most under the Nile Valley high culture, and was in the midst of their 14th dynasty of Timeri, Ta-Nehisi, and Ethiopia. Unfortunately, for the past 200 years or more, Orthodox history, as written by European and European American writers and academians, have been related primarily to wars and the nobility that caused them, very little ever being stated in the cause of the so-called common or little man, but it was the royalty of the Ta-Nehisi, along with the common people north of the first cataract, that the people of Timeri and its nobility had to fight for the second time in their history during the second dynasty, 2800 BCE. The proof of this historical event is recorded in a fragmented inscription that is presently misnomered in the Heracompolis stone. It is an apparent depiction of Pharaoh Khase Khennu kneeling on a Nubian prisoner, but there is a similar type of inscription that came down to us from the 4th dynasty, 2720 BCE, showing Pharaoh Sneferu allegedly destroying Nubia, this being the so-called Palermo stone. If one is to assume that the indigenous Africans of Timeri, blacks and brown people, were superior racially to their indigenous sisters and brothers of Ta-Nehisi, blacks and browns, fellow Africans, because of their military victories in the above-mentioned wars detailed in the inscription, then the logic must equally hold true that the European and European American Caucasians of the United States of America, white, are of a superior race to the Germans and Italians of Caucasian Europes. But the same inferior Africans of Ta-Nehisi were the people who actually opened up and worked with diorite quarries and made all of the cast and carved stone figures for most of Timeri's colossal monuments, also their own, such as Abu Simbel and Tumars during the 4th dynasty, 2723 through 2563 BCE. They were the same inferiors from whom the Taimyrian superiors stole 200,000 sheep and cattle and captured 7,000 prisoners during the Taimyri-Tahanisi Wars of the Third Dynasty, 2720 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Sneferu. There are many samples of unused diorite inscriptions found at two quarries by certain Egyptologists and others from Europe, European America, and Asia, which they stole from the Nile Valley indigenous Africans. This desecration of the graves by said people, most of whom called themselves religious names as Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc., continues as the robbers remove from Akubulan all of her treasures year after year. Many others, called anthropologists and Egyptologists, have stolen countless numbers of African artifacts that find their way into the public and private museum collections of some Europe's, England, and United States of America, most distinguished citizens or subjects, with all of the blessings of the religious heads of each of the so-called Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But not one of those robbers and grave snatchers paid one solitary penny or received any consent whatsoever for the removal and confiscation of the said treasures of the properties of the indigenous Africans and their descendants from their legitimate owners' possession. This role the Nubian Africans, Tahanisians, supposedly played for the Egyptian Africans, Taimyrians, both of them, the Tahanisians and the Taimyrians, black members of the so-called Negro or Negro race, which allegedly extended until the reign of the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, 2270 BCE, whose inscription bear his name, Marner. The latter artifact and inscription was unearthed at an area around the first cataract, where the first so-called boundary line between Taimyri and Tahanisi allegedly had been pushed southward by the military forces from the north. Upper Egypt, however, quarrying activities further south in Tahanisi proved that the so-called inferior race, the Nubians or Tahanisians, were involved in such production long before the northern reaches of their own homeland were annexed by the Taimyrians after many wars of conquest. Inscriptions from points still farther south refer to much later wars in which the Tahanisians lost more of Tahanisians' territories to the Taimyrians, to the point of having the lords of Magi, Ertet, and Wawat surrender to the Taimyrians' military control over their country. From many more inscriptions, which still exist in private and public collections, we can still note that the struggles put up by the greatest soldiers of Tahanisi in defense of their homeland. One of the foremost descriptions dealing with these wars was written in the so-called inscription of Uni, governors of northern Tahanisi, which was distorted by white liberal Africanist Orthodox historians to appear that parts of northern Tahanisi and Nubri or Zeti were in southern Taimyri, Kemet-sized Egypt. It also mentioned many other projects at Abydos, which the Taimyrians took under the reign of the viceroy overlord, Uni, for his pharaoh, Marner. These projects included the continuation of the largest boat building industry on the entire Nile River, 4,100 miles length from Uganda to central East Alkebulan to the Mediterranean Sea, which Uni met when he arrived in Tahanisi. The best woods from Wawat were used for this industry, brought for the site of construction on the canals the Tahanisis built by diverting the Nile River for irrigation and shipping before their conquest by the Taimyrians. These canals were also used to ship materials, finished products, and craftsmen down north to Taimyrian, natural resources and their manufactured byproducts, and the craftsmen that produced them were also bought from points further up south from this industry. They came from Tahanisi's Yam, Ertet, Medju, and Kayat, from Ethiopia, and to the southeast at Punat, the most eastern point of the continent of Alkebulan. The boats were of a type which the Taimarians were incapable of building at this early period in their high culture, 2423 through 2242 BCE. The purpose of such extremely large boats was to transport the colossal hand-carved and uncarved granite of dorite blocks and stones down north on the Nile River from the Ta-Nehisi to Taimari for the construction and erection of the stele and the pyramid of Pharaoh Marmar, and for many other pharaohs before and after him. It is surely during this dynasty, the 6th dynasty, 2565 through 2420, that the Ta-Nehisi truly became the conquered victims of the Taimarians, who forced them to surrender most of their individuality in their high culture and adopt every aspect of their fellow Africans from the north. However, being that the Hyksos, the so-called white Semites or shepherd kings from Beduina, did not arrive in Taimari until the 11th to the 15th dynasty, 1675 through 1600 BCE, neither the white Caucasians nor Macedonian Greeks until the ending of the 30th dynasty, 332 BCE, which they caused by their defeat of the Persian interlopers. As such, one can definitely state that the indigenous Africans of Ta-Nehisi and Taimari were still of the same people racially, though at various times they differed somewhat politically. The beginning of their political separation, not racial separation, actually began around the 3rd dynasty, 2780 through 2680 BCE, and not before. A much broader and intricate detailing of the data in the introduction is given in the following chronologies, graphs, charts, and pictures of this chapter. In them, most of the information outlined on a general basis above are shown in detail and are documented with respect to their socio-political and historical-graphical perspectives. Along with the details are the biographical materials and glossary presented for the student, professors, researchers, and general readers' convenience and clearer understanding of the otherwise complex data. History will yet show that the following information is but a very minute part of the glorious truth that was once the common high culture of the entire Nile valleys, blue and white, and all of the other high cultures of Alkebulan, Mother Africa. It will show that the first indigenous Africans of the lower Nile Valley around the Delta region came from Central Africa, Africa south of the Sahara, as it is misnomered by European and European American Africanists. It may also prove that the original home of all of mankind was in the same area where the oldest fossil man, Zinjanthropus bozi, known to date, evolved in Tanzania, Central East Alkebulan. The scene is extracted from the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, Egyptian Book of the Dead, as translated into English by Sir E.A. Wallace Bulge, London, 1895, and the Papyrus of Ani, the deceased. Ani is shown at the extreme left being led by the god Anubis. A similar scene is depicted many times in the Papyrus of Ani and the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, where Ani is shown in the boat of Amenta, traveling across the treacherous water of the underworld on his way to be received by Ra, who was to make him another of the gods of Taimari.